For 20 years, I nursed a wound that felt more familiar than love. What I didn't know was that the hate I was feeding was slowly devouring the person I was meant to become. If you've ever carried bitterness so long it feels like part of your DNA, this story will show you there's a way out. Comment forgiveness if you need the courage to let go of what's been holding you captive. I'm about to share the darkest part of my heart and how God used it to show me that some prisons have keys we're too afraid to use. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Ephesians 4:32. I was 16 when I learned that fathers could be monsters, and 46 when I discovered that daughters could become them too. The night that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in October. I was a junior in high school, sitting at our kitchen table trying to make sense of algebra homework while my mother hummed softly as she washed dishes. The sound of her contentment should have been comforting, but it only made what was about to happen feel more like a betrayal of everything safe I'd ever known. My father came home later than usual, and I could smell the alcohol on him before he even reached the kitchen. This wasn't unusual. He'd been coming home with that particular scent more and more often, but something about his posture, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes couldn't quite focus, told me this night would be different. "Where's my dinner?" he asked my mother, his voice carrying that dangerous edge I'd learned to recognize as a warning signal. "I kept it warm for you," she replied gently, the way she always did, as if kindness could somehow shield us from what was building in the air like an electrical storm. What happened next unfolded in slow motion, the way traumatic moments do when your brain is trying to process something too terrible to accept. He looked at the plate she set before him. Pot roast and mashed potatoes, the same meal she'd been making on Tuesdays for as long as I could remember, and his face twisted with disgust. "This is garbage," he said, picking up the plate and hurling it against the wall. If you've ever felt like someone stole your childhood and left you with only anger to show for it, you'll understand what I'm about to share. The ceramic shattered with a sound that seemed to echo in my bones, gravy and potatoes sliding down the yellow wallpaper my mother had hung with such care the summer before. But it wasn't the broken plate that broke something in me. It was what he said next. Just like everything else in this house, just like this pathetic excuse for a family, just like you. His finger pointed at my mother, but his eyes found mine. And just like her. The words hit me like physical blows, not because they were shouted, he barely raised his voice, but because they were delivered with such cold certainty, as if he'd been thinking them for years and had finally found the perfect moment to let them destroy us. My mother stood frozen by the sink, dish towel still in her hands, tears sliding down her cheeks in silent rivulets. She didn't defend herself. She didn't defend me. She just stood there and absorbed his cruelty like she'd been doing for years. And I realized in that moment that this wasn't the first time he'd said these things. It was just the first time I'd been there to witness it. "Don't you ever," he continued, his voice getting quieter and somehow more menacing, "don't you ever think you're anything special. Either of you. You're lucky I keep you around at all. I'm going to tell you about the night my father broke something in me that I didn't think could be repaired, and how that brokenness nearly destroyed everything I tried to build afterward." The silence that followed his words was thick with something I'd never experienced before. Not just fear, but a particular kind of hopelessness that comes from realizing the person who's supposed to protect you is actually the thing you need protection from. I sat at that kitchen table, algebra homework forgotten, watching my mother clean up the mess he'd made while he walked away as if nothing had happened. She moved like someone in a trance, carefully picking up pieces of broken ceramic, wiping gravy from the wall, restoring order to a space that would never feel safe again. "Mom," I whispered, but she shook her head without looking at me. "Not now, sweetheart. Just not now." That was the night I learned that love could be conditional, that safety was an illusion, and that the people who claimed to care about you could use your vulnerabilities as weapons. But more than that, it was the night I made a promise to myself that would poison the next 20 years of my life. I will never let him hurt me again. I will never forgive him for this. I will never be weak enough to need his approval or love or anything he thinks he can give or take away. At 16, that promise felt like strength. It felt like armor. It felt like the only way to survive in a house where love had been weaponized and used against the people who dared to trust it. What I didn't know was that the bitterness I was nursing would become more destructive than the wound that caused it. The next morning, everything looked the same, but felt different. The kitchen had been restored to its usual order, the broken plate replaced, the wall scrubbed clean. My mother made breakfast like she always did, asked about my homework, reminded me about my dentist appointment after school. My father sat at the table reading his newspaper, drinking his coffee, looking for all the world like a normal dad getting ready for a normal day. But I could see the careful distance my mother maintained, the way she moved around him without quite looking at him, the way her smiles didn't reach her eyes. And I could see something else, the way he watched her, waiting for any sign that she might challenge what he'd done, ready to remind her, remind us both, that he was the one with the power to create or destroy peace in our home. I ate my cereal and watched this dance of avoidance and control and felt something harden in my chest that I wouldn't recognize as hatred for several more years. At the time, I just knew that I felt different, older, colder, more awake to the ugliness that could hide behind familiar faces. School became my refuge, the only place where I could pretend to be a normal teenager with normal problems. I threw myself into my studies with the desperate intensity of someone who discovered that achievement was the only currency that couldn't be taken away by a drunk father's cruelty. I made honor roll, joined the debate team, volunteered for everything, built a resume that screamed worth something to anyone who might be listening. But at home, I became a different person, watchful, wary, building walls around my heart that I told myself were protection, but were actually prison cells I was constructing one bitter brick at a time. Drop a heart if you know what it feels like to have your trust shattered by someone who was supposed to protect you. The worst part wasn't the occasional explosions. Those, at least, were honest in their cruelty. The worst part was the aftermath, when he'd pretend nothing had happened, when he'd try to return to playing the role of loving father as if his words hadn't carved permanent scars into the people who shared his name. He'd bring home flowers for my mother, not as an apology but as a reset button, a way to erase the evidence of his cruelty without ever acknowledging it had occurred. He'd ruffle my hair and ask about school, genuinely seeming to care about my answers, as if he hadn't spent the previous evening systematically destroying my ability to trust that his affection was real. These moments of apparent normalcy were almost worse than his rages because they forced me to question my own perceptions. Was I being too sensitive? Was I holding on to hurt that I should have let go? Was I the problem for not being able to forget and move on the way my mother seemed to? But I couldn't forget. Every kind gesture felt like manipulation. Every moment of apparent warmth felt like a trap. Every time he said, "I love you," I heard the unspoken addendum. When you're not disappointing me, when you're not inconveniencing me, when you're being the daughter I want instead of the person you actually are. I started keeping a mental inventory of his cruelties, cataloging each harsh word, each moment of emotional violence, each time he chose alcohol over his family's well-being. I told myself I was being smart, protecting myself by staying alert to his true nature. What I was actually doing was building a case against him that would consume me for the next 2 decades. By my senior year, I'd perfected the art of emotional distance. I spoke to him only when necessary, answered his questions with the minimum required politeness, participated in family meals like I was serving a sentence rather than sharing time with people who loved me. I convinced myself this coldness was strength, that my ability to withstand his attempts at connection was evidence of my superior character. Have you ever hated someone so deeply it became part of your personality? College couldn't come fast enough. I chose a school 600 miles away, far enough that I couldn't be expected to come home for every holiday, close enough that I couldn't be accused of completely abandoning my family. I threw myself into campus life with the same desperate energy I'd once applied to high school achievement, joining organizations, making friends, dating boys who couldn't understand why I flinched when they raised their voices, or why I became suspicious whenever they were kind to me for no apparent reason. I majored in psychology, telling myself I wanted to help people, but really I was trying to understand how someone could claim to love you while systematically destroying your ability to believe in that love. I studied family dynamics and childhood trauma and the long-term effects of emotional abuse, finding clinical names for experiences that had felt too overwhelming to process as a teenager. My professors praised my insight, my ability to see patterns that other students missed, my intuitive understanding of the ways that pain could be passed down through generations like a genetic inheritance. What they didn't know was that every paper I wrote, every case study I analyzed was really an attempt to understand my father, and by extension, to understand myself. During my sophomore year, I met David, a sweet, steady pre-med student who made me laugh and never raised his voice and seemed genuinely puzzled by my hypervigilance around anger and conflict. He was everything my father wasn't, gentle, reliable, emotionally available, and I fell in love with him the way someone falls in love with safety after years of walking on unstable ground. We dated for 3 years, and he proposed the week after graduation. I said yes, not just because I loved him, but because marrying him felt like the final proof that I'd escaped my father's influence, that I could build a life completely separate from the poison I'd grown up breathing. But even as I planned our wedding, even as I chose flowers and dresses and wrote vows about forever, I carried my father's voice with me like a malignant growth I couldn't excise. When David complimented me, I heard my father's criticism. When David was patient with my moods, I wondered how long it would be before his kindness curdled into resentment. When David said he loved me, I braced myself for the moment he'd discover I wasn't worth loving after all. I invited my parents to the wedding, because not inviting them would have required explanations I wasn't ready to give, conversations about family dysfunction that felt too messy for the pristine new life I was trying to build. My father walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes, told everyone at the reception how proud he was of his beautiful daughter, danced with me to Butterfly Kisses, while I stood rigid in his arms, counting the seconds until the song would end and I could return to my new husband's side. That night, in our hotel room, David asked me why I'd seemed so tense during the father-daughter dance. I wasn't tense, I lied, because the truth, that I'd been struggling not to pull away from my father's touch, that his pride in me felt like another form of possession, that even on my wedding day, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was performing love rather than feeling it. It was too complicated to explain to someone who'd grown up in a house where fathers were sources of comfort rather than sources of fear. David looked at me with concern, started to ask another question, then seemed to think better of it. But I could see the confusion in his eyes, the first crack in his understanding of the woman he'd just married. It wouldn't be the last. Our first year of marriage was happy in all the ways that mattered. We laughed together, built a home together, dreamed about the future we were going to create. But underneath my joy was a current of anxiety I couldn't name, a waiting for the other shoe to drop, a hypervigilance that scanned every interaction for signs that David was about to transform into someone cruel. When he was late coming home from work, I immediately assumed he was avoiding me. When he was quiet during dinner, I interpreted his silence as evidence that he was planning to leave. When he forgot to call during his lunch break, I spent the afternoon constructing elaborate theories about what I'd done wrong, how I'd disappointed him, why he was beginning to see me the way my father had taught me to see myself. David bore these accusations with patience and grace, reassuring me over and over that his love wasn't conditional, that his occasional moods had nothing to do with me, that I could trust him to be honest about his feelings rather than storing them up as weapons to use against me later. But I couldn't believe him, not because he wasn't trustworthy, but because my father had taught me that love was a performance, that kindness was a manipulation, that the people who claimed to care about you were always waiting for the right moment to remind you how little you actually mattered to them. The fight started small, me overreacting to perceived slights, David getting frustrated with my inability to take him at his word, both of us confused about how we'd ended up arguing about things that shouldn't have been arguments at all. But they escalated, as fights do when one person is defensive and the other is bewildered, when one person is fighting for their life and the other doesn't even know a battle is being waged. "I'm not your father," David would say during our worst moments, and the words hit me like slaps because they forced me to acknowledge what I'd been hiding even from myself, that I'd been so busy protecting myself from my father's cruelty that I'd started seeing it everywhere, even in places where it didn't exist. But knowing this didn't make me able to stop. The patterns were too deep, the wounds too familiar, the protective mechanisms too automatic. I'd spent so many years building walls around my heart that I'd forgotten how to let safe people inside them. 3 years into our marriage, David gently suggested that I might want to talk to someone about my relationship with my father. Not because he thought there was something wrong with me, he was careful to explain, but because he could see how much pain I was carrying, how exhausting it must be to live with that level of vigilance and mistrust. "I'm fine," I told him, because admitting I wasn't fine would have meant admitting my father still had power over my life, that despite all my education and achievements and distance, I was still the 16-year-old girl sitting at a kitchen table watching her world shatter like ceramic against a wall. "You wake up angry," David said gently. "Every morning. Before anything has even happened, you're already braced for disappointment, already expecting to be hurt. That's not fine, sweetheart. That's survival mode." He was right, but being right didn't make his words easier to hear. I'd been in survival mode for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply live, to move through the world without constantly scanning for threats, to love someone without simultaneously preparing for the moment they'd prove themselves unworthy of that love. That night, alone in our bedroom while David slept peacefully beside me, I finally allowed myself to ask the question I'd been avoiding for 7 years. What if my father's cruelty had done more than hurt me? What if it had changed me into someone I didn't want to be? The answer terrified me more than his anger ever had, because anger, at least, had felt like strength. This growing awareness that I might be broken in ways I couldn't fix, that I might be carrying forward the very toxicity I'd tried so hard to escape, felt like a weakness I couldn't afford to acknowledge. So I didn't. I pushed the question down, buried it under layers of accomplishment and busyness and the exhausting work of maintaining a marriage while keeping my deepest fears locked away. I told myself that awareness was enough, that recognizing the problem meant I was already solving it. But problems don't solve themselves through recognition alone. And the hatred I'd been nurturing for my father, hatred I'd convinced myself was justified, protective, even righteous, was growing like a cancer in my chest, spreading its poison into every relationship I tried to build, every moment of peace I tried to enjoy, every attempt I made to become someone worthy of the love I claimed to want. I believed I was better off without my father in my life, that my anger toward him was evidence of my moral superiority, that maintaining my resentment was a form of justice for crimes he'd never been held accountable for. What I didn't realize was that a quiet spiritual disruption was beginning to form in the depths of my carefully controlled life, a disruption that would eventually force me to confront not just what my father had done to me, but what I had done to myself in response. The first sign came during a sermon I wasn't even supposed to be hearing. David and I had started attending church sporadically, mostly because he'd grown up going and I was trying to be the kind of wife who supported her husband's traditions. I usually spent the service making mental grocery lists or planning our week, letting the pastor's words wash over me without really listening. But that particular Sunday, one sentence broke through my distraction like a voice speaking directly to my hidden wound. Sometimes the person we need to forgive most isn't the one who hurt us. It's the person we've become because of that hurt. I felt the words land in my chest like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples I couldn't control. Around me, other parishioners nodded and murmured agreement, but I sat frozen, afraid that if I moved or breathed too deeply, I might shatter the fragile barrier I'd built between my public self and the rage that lived at my core. For the rest of the service, I couldn't focus on anything except that one sentence echoing in my mind. The person we've become because of that hurt. What had I become? And more terrifyingly, what was I becoming? The drive home was quiet, David sensing my mood without needing explanation. But that night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling while my husband slept peacefully beside me, I found myself thinking about my father for the first time in months, not with the familiar anger that usually accompanied such thoughts, but with something that felt dangerously close to curiosity. What would happen if I tried to understand him instead of hating him? What would happen if I stopped feeding the bitterness that had become as familiar as breathing? What would happen if I chose something other than the anger that had been my companion for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to live without it? The question scared me more than any of his rages ever had, because they suggested possibilities I wasn't ready to consider, that forgiveness might be necessary not for his sake, but for mine. That the prison I thought I'd escaped was actually one I'd built around my own heart, that the father I'd spent 20 years hating might not be the only person in need of grace. But I wasn't ready for those possibilities yet, not even close. So I pushed them down, rolled over, and went to sleep, telling myself that some wounds were too deep for healing, some people too toxic for forgiveness, some anger too justified to ever let go. I had no idea that God was already beginning to show me why I was wrong. In your anger, do not sin. When you are on your beds, search your hearts and be silent. Psalm 4:4. Success became my mask, but underneath, I was rotting from the inside out, poisoned by a grudge I'd been feeding for decades. 10 years into my marriage with David, I had built what anyone looking from the outside would call a beautiful life. I'd finished my master's degree in counseling, opened a private practice specializing in family trauma, bought a house in a neighborhood where children rode bicycles on tree-lined streets, and neighbors brought casseroles when someone was sick. My calendar was full of speaking engagements about healing from childhood wounds. My office walls were covered with certificates and thank you notes from clients who credited me with saving their marriages, their relationships with their children, their ability to trust again. I had waiting lists of people desperate for appointments, colleagues who referred their most difficult cases to me because I had a reputation for understanding pain that others couldn't reach. Pause here if you need a moment. Some wounds echo louder when we finally admit they're still bleeding. But success, I was learning, could be the most sophisticated form of hiding. Every day, I helped other people process their anger, release their resentments, forgive their parents and spouses and children for the ways they'd been hurt. I spoke eloquently about the freedom that comes from letting go, the peace that follows forgiveness, the strength that grows from choosing healing over bitterness. And every night, I went home to a marriage that was slowly suffocating under the weight of emotions I refused to feel, wounds I refused to acknowledge, and a rage toward my father that had become so familiar, I'd stopped recognizing it as anything other than truth. David tried, in the patient way that had made me fall in love with him, to understand why I could guide others toward forgiveness, but couldn't find my way there myself. He'd listen to me debrief difficult sessions with clients, watch me help families rebuild trust after betrayal, see me celebrate breakthroughs with people who'd been stuck in cycles of hurt for decades. "You're amazing at what you do," he told me one evening, after I'd shared a particularly moving story about helping a daughter reconnect with her estranged mother. "I just wish you could give yourself the same compassion you give your clients." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "Your father," he said gently. "It's been 15 years since that night in the kitchen you told me about. 15 years since you've spoken to him. Don't you think it might be time to—" "To what?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended. To pretend it didn't happen? To act like emotional abuse doesn't have lasting consequences? To forgive someone who's never apologized, never acknowledged what he did, never shown any evidence that he's changed? David was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. To stop letting what he did control your life. Type trapped. If you've ever felt successful on the outside, but empty on the inside because of unforgiveness, the conversation ended there, as it always did, with me retreating into the professional persona that had become my shield. I was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, licensed therapist, expert in family trauma, woman who had overcome her difficult childhood to help others do the same. I was not Sarah, the daughter still bleeding from wounds inflicted 20 years ago, still jumping at unexpected loud noises, still incapable of receiving love without suspicion. But late at night, when the house was quiet and David was sleeping and I was alone with the thoughts I spent my days helping others process, I knew he was right. The anger I carried toward my father wasn't just affecting my relationship with him, it was affecting everything. I saw it in the way I interacted with male authority figures, always expecting them to abuse their power, always braced for disappointment. I saw it in my friendships with other women, the way I couldn't quite trust their kindness, couldn't quite believe their affection wasn't conditional. I saw it in my marriage, the way I held parts of myself back even from David, the way I tested his love with moods and withdrawal, and the impossible task of proving he would stay, even when I gave him every reason to leave. Most painfully, I saw it in my work. For all my professional success, for all the lives I'd helped transform, there was a cynical edge to my practice that I tried to hide, but couldn't quite eliminate. When clients talked about forgiving parents who'd disappointed them, part of me wanted to warn them against being naive. When they spoke about reconciling with family members who'd hurt them, something in me whispered that they were setting themselves up for more pain. I'd become an expert in healing everyone except myself. The dream started during my 3rd year in private practice. Always the same scenario. I'd be in my office with a client, listening to them describe pain that mirrored my own childhood experiences, offering them insight and strategies for moving forward. But when I opened my mouth to speak, my father's voice would come out instead, cruel, dismissive, destructive. I'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, David stirring beside me with concern. "Another nightmare?" he'd ask, and I'd nod, letting him hold me until my breathing slowed, never telling him that the real terror wasn't what my father had done to me, but what I was afraid I might do to others. Because the truth I couldn't admit to anyone, not even myself, was that I could feel his poison working its way through my system. When David left dishes in the sink, I heard my father's voice in my head calling him lazy. When clients canceled appointments at the last minute, I felt his rage surge through me before I could catch it. When cashiers moved too slowly or servers made mistakes, his contempt would flicker across my face before I could hide it behind professional composure. I was becoming him, one small cruelty at a time, one moment of impatience at a time, one flash of anger at a time. And the more I recognized it, the more desperate I became to stop it, the more I tried to control my reactions and monitor my words and force myself to be the person I thought I should be instead of the person I was becoming. The breaking point came during a session with a woman named Carol, whose story was so similar to mine it felt like looking into a distorted mirror. She was 53, successful in her career, married to a kind man who didn't understand why she couldn't move past her childhood. Her father had been an alcoholic who'd verbally abused her and her mother until she'd left home at 18 and never looked back. "I don't understand why everyone expects me to forgive him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He destroyed my ability to trust anyone. He's the reason I can't have children. I'm too afraid I'd become like him. He took everything from me, and now I'm supposed to just let it go because family is family, because forgiveness is supposed to be healing." I opened my mouth to offer her the same wisdom I'd shared with hundreds of other clients, that forgiveness isn't about excusing someone's behavior, it's about freeing yourself from the burden of carrying their poison. That holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, that she couldn't heal what she wouldn't release. But looking at her face, at the pain and confusion and desperate need to be understood rather than fixed, I realized I didn't believe a word of what I was about to say. "You know what?" I said instead, my professional mask slipping for the first time in years. "Maybe you don't have to forgive him. Maybe some things are unforgivable. Maybe the people who tell you to forgive have never been hurt the way you've been hurt." The words felt like rebellion, like permission to stop pretending that healing was always possible, that love could conquer all, that forgiveness was the answer to every wound that had ever been inflicted. Carol looked at me with something like relief. "Really? You think it's okay to still be angry?" "I think," I said slowly, surprised by my own honesty, "that anyone who tells you your anger isn't justified has never lived with the consequences of someone else's cruelty." The session ended with Carol feeling validated in her pain rather than challenged to move beyond it. She left my office with permission to stay angry, to keep her walls up, to protect herself from a father who'd proven himself unworthy of her trust. And I sat alone in my office afterward, realizing that I'd just given her the same advice I'd been giving myself for 20 years, that some wounds don't heal, some people don't change, and some anger is too righteous to release. What bitterness have you carried for so long that it feels safer than healing? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Carol's face when I'd given her permission to stay angry, the relief that had flooded her features when I'd told her that forgiveness wasn't mandatory. But underneath my satisfaction at helping her feel understood was a growing unease, a sense that I'd led her down a path I wasn't sure either of us should be walking. I got up and went to my home office, pulling out the journals I'd been keeping since graduate school. Pages and pages of insights about healing and growth and the human capacity for transformation. Reading through them, I was struck by the gap between what I knew intellectually and what I felt emotionally, between the wisdom I offered others and the bitterness I nursed in my own heart. On impulse, I pulled out a fresh notebook and began writing, not as Dr. Mitchell the therapist, but as Sarah the daughter, the woman who'd been carrying a wound for 20 years and calling it strength. I hate him, I wrote, the words feeling dangerous and honest in equal measure. I hate him for what he did to my mother. I hate him for what he did to me. I hate him for making me afraid of love, afraid of trust, afraid of my own anger. I hate him for the way he still lives in my head, commenting on my choices, questioning my worth, reminding me that I'm not good enough, smart enough, strong enough to deserve the life I've built. The words poured out of me like poison from a lanced wound, page after page of rage and hurt and disappointment I'd been storing up for decades. I wrote about the father I'd wished for and never had, the childhood I'd lost to his alcoholism and cruelty, the woman I might have been if I'd grown up feeling safe and loved and worthy. But as I wrote, something else began to emerge between the lines, a recognition that my hatred had become its own kind of prison, that the walls I'd built to keep him out were also keeping me trapped inside with my pain. I thought about Carol, about the relief on her face when I'd told her it was okay to stay angry. But was it okay? Was anger that lasted 20 years still justified? Or had it become something else entirely, a habit, an identity, a way of being in the world that had outlived its usefulness? I thought about David, about the way he'd been trying for 10 years to love a woman who was afraid to be fully loved, who kept part of herself locked away in a room marked "Do Not Enter," who'd rather be right about her father's cruelty than risk being wrong about her need for forgiveness. I thought about my clients, about all the people I'd helped find their way to healing while I remained stuck in the same patterns I'd developed as a teenager, frozen in a moment of pain that had defined every moment that came after. Most unsettling of all, I thought about the woman I was becoming, not just someone who'd been hurt by her father, but someone who was passing that hurt along in subtle ways, whose unhealed wounds were creating new wounds in the people around her. The next morning, I called in sick to work, the first time I'd done so in 3 years. David found me still in my pajamas at noon, surrounded by pages of handwritten notes, looking like I'd been hit by a truck. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting down beside me on the couch. I said slowly, "I've been giving terrible advice." I told him about Carol, about the permission I'd given her to stay angry, about the growing realization that I'd been using my professional expertise to justify my own emotional stagnation. "I've been telling people that forgiveness is necessary for healing," I said, "but I don't believe it. At least, I don't believe it applies to me. I think some people are too toxic to forgive. I think some wounds are too deep to heal. I think some anger is too justified to release." David was quiet for a long moment. "And how's that working out for you?" The question hit me like a physical blow because the answer was obvious. It wasn't working at all. 20 years of righteous anger had made me successful in my career, but unsuccessful in my life, skilled at helping others heal but unable to heal myself, expert in love but afraid to fully receive it. "I don't know how to let it go," I whispered. "The anger is all I have left of that night. If I forgive him, what proof do I have that what he did mattered? If I stop being angry, who's going to remember that he hurt us? Who's going to hold him accountable?" "Maybe," David said gently, "the question isn't who's going to hold him accountable. Maybe the question is who's going to hold you accountable for the person you're becoming, because you won't let go." His words echoed in my mind for days. The person I was becoming. I'd been so focused on what my father had done to me that I'd lost sight of what I was doing to myself and to everyone around me by refusing to release the anger that had become my constant companion. I started paying attention to my thoughts differently, noticing how often my father's voice intruded on my daily life. When I was stuck in traffic, I could hear him cursing other drivers. When David was late coming home, I could feel his paranoid suspicion creeping into my thoughts. When clients disappointed me, his contempt would flicker across my features before I could stop it. I was carrying his poison in my bloodstream, and it was slowly killing everything healthy in my life. The spiritual nudges started small, a sermon about the freedom that comes from forgiveness that I couldn't quite dismiss, a client who shared how releasing resentment had transformed her marriage, a book David left on my nightstand about the neuroscience of forgiveness and its impact on mental health. I resisted each one, defending my anger like it was a treasure instead of a burden, insisting that forgiveness was for people who'd been hurt less severely, people whose fathers had apologized, people whose wounds weren't as deep or justified as mine. But the nudges kept coming, persistent as water wearing away stone, a verse that wouldn't leave my mind. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. A random encounter with a woman at the grocery store who'd mentioned forgiving her abusive stepfather and how it had saved her life. A dream where I was drowning in a sea of my own tears while my father stood on the shore, and the only way to reach safety was to stop swimming away from him and start swimming toward forgiveness. I thought bitterness was my strength. I didn't know it was my cage. The realization that I needed help came gradually, then all at once. I was sitting in my office between clients, looking out the window at people walking past on the sidewalk, normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of ancient anger. When it hit me, I was a fraud. Not because I wasn't good at my job, but because I was offering people a healing I didn't believe in, a freedom I'd never experienced, a peace I'd convinced myself was impossible for someone with my particular wounds. How could I tell people that forgiveness was the path to healing when I'd refused to walk that path myself? How could I help others release their anger when I'd been feeding mine for 20 years? How could I guide anyone toward wholeness when I was fundamentally broken in ways I was too proud to admit? That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since graduate school. I made an appointment with a therapist, not for my clients, not for continuing education, but for myself. Sarah, the daughter who was still sitting at that kitchen table watching her father destroy her ability to trust that love was safe. The appointment was 3 weeks away, but making it felt like the first honest thing I'd done in years. I was finally ready to admit that my expertise in healing others hadn't healed me, that my anger toward my father was costing me more than his original cruelty ever had, that I was drowning in bitterness I'd been calling strength. I didn't know how to forgive him yet. I wasn't sure I wanted to, but I was beginning to understand that the cost of not forgiving him was becoming too high to pay, that I was sacrificing my marriage, my peace, my ability to fully love and be loved on the altar of an anger that had outlived its usefulness. For the first time in 20 years, I was ready to consider the possibility that there might be another way to live, another way to honor my pain without being imprisoned by it, another way to hold my father accountable without destroying myself in the process. I still didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but I was finally ready to find out what it might cost me to stay exactly as I was. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Proverbs 4:23. The moment I realized I was becoming my father was the moment I understood why God commands us to forgive, not for their sake, but for our own. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had kind eyes and a voice that somehow managed to be both gentle and unflinching. Her office felt safe in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood: soft lighting, comfortable chairs, tissues within easy reach, and an absence of judgment that I could feel the moment I walked through her door. "What brings you here today?" she asked during our first session, and I found myself staring at my hands, surprised by how difficult it was to form words around a truth I'd been avoiding for 20 years. I said finally, "I've become the person I spent my whole life trying not to become. This is where I learned that some mirrors show you things you never wanted to see, but desperately needed to." The first few sessions were like archaeological digs, carefully excavating layers of pain and defense mechanisms I'd built up over decades. Dr. Martinez didn't rush me toward forgiveness or try to convince me that my anger wasn't justified. Instead, she helped me understand something that terrified me more than my father's rage ever had: the ways I'd internalized his voice and made it my own. "Tell me about a recent argument with David," she said during our fourth session. I described a fight we'd had the week before, something small and stupid about him leaving his coffee mug on the counter instead of putting it in the dishwasher. What had started as a minor irritation had escalated into a screaming match that ended with me storming out of the house and David looking at me like I was a stranger. "What did you say to him?" Dr. Martinez asked. I repeated the words I'd hurled at my husband in my anger. "You're lazy and inconsiderate, and you never think about anyone but yourself. You take everything I do for granted and give nothing back." The silence that followed was deafening, because we both knew whose voice I'd been channeling. The words were nearly identical to ones my father had screamed at my mother 25 years ago, during one of his drunken rages about the state of the house. "How did it feel to say those things?" she asked gently. "Powerful," I admitted, the honesty burning my throat. For about 30 seconds, it felt powerful. And then I trailed off, remembering the look on David's face, the way he'd physically recoiled as if I'd slapped him. Then what? Then I felt like a monster. If this story is cutting close to the bone, hit that like button. Sometimes the truth hurts before it heals. Over the following weeks, Dr. Martinez helped me see patterns I'd been blind to for years. The way I shut down emotionally when David tried to address conflict, just like my mother had done. The way I used silence as a weapon, withholding affection and communication to punish perceived slights. The way I'd perfected the art of making people feel small with carefully chosen words and strategically timed coldness. Most devastating of all was the realization that I'd been using my professional success as a shield, hiding behind my expertise in healing to avoid examining my own wounds. I could help other people forgive their parents because it was easier than forgiving my own. I could guide others toward emotional freedom because I didn't have to follow them there. "You've become very skilled at helping people heal from wounds like yours," Dr. Martinez observed during one session. "But what would happen if you applied the same compassion to yourself that you show your clients?" The question hit me like a physical blow because the answer was obvious. I'd never tried. I'd spent 20 years treating myself like the enemy, monitoring my thoughts and behaviors with the same critical eye my father had turned on our family. I'd become my own worst critic, my own harshest judge, my own most unforgiving accuser. "I don't know how," I whispered. "I don't know how to be kind to myself when I'm becoming everything I hate." "What if," she said gently, "you're not becoming your father? What if you're just carrying his pain along with your own, and it's making you sick?" The idea that my father might have been in pain, rather than simply cruel, was revolutionary and terrifying. It suggested that his anger had come from somewhere, that his cruelty might have been learned rather than inherent, that he might have been as trapped by his own wounds as I was by mine. But it also suggested something even more unsettling, that my anger toward him, justified as it was, had become its own form of poison, its own source of cruelty, its own way of perpetuating the very cycles I claimed to want to break. I was protecting a wound that had been bleeding for decades, and the blood was staining everything I touched. The breakthrough came during our 8th session, on a rainy Thursday in November. I'd been telling Dr. Martinez about a particularly difficult week. David and I had barely spoken since our fight about the coffee mug. I'd snapped at 3 different clients, and I'd found myself avoiding my own reflection because I didn't like the person I saw looking back at me. "I keep thinking about something you said the first day we met," she said. "You told me you'd become the person you spent your whole life trying not to become. But what if that's not the whole truth?" "What do you mean? What if you've become someone who's so afraid of being hurt again that you've started hurting others first? What if your anger toward your father has become your way of staying safe, but it's also becoming your way of staying isolated?" The words hung in the air between us like a confession I wasn't ready to make. Because she was right, and we both knew it. My anger had become my armor, my protection, my way of keeping the world at a safe distance where no one could disappoint me the way my father had. But armor that keeps everyone out also keeps you locked in. "I read something this week that made me think of you," Dr. Martinez continued, pulling out a small piece of paper. "It's from Matthew 7:3. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? The verse hit me like lightning, illuminating a truth I'd been hiding from in the darkness of my own righteousness. For 20 years, I'd been so focused on my father's failures, his cruelty, his inability to love us the way we deserved, that I'd become blind to my own transformation into someone equally capable of emotional violence. I thought of David's face during our fight, the way he'd looked at me with confusion and hurt when I'd attacked him with words designed to wound. I thought of my clients, the way I'd started viewing their struggles with cynicism rather than compassion. I thought of my mother, who I'd barely spoken to in 5 years because being around her reminded me of my father's abuse and my own inability to move beyond it. I had become what I hated, not because I was like my father, but because my hatred of him had consumed everything healthy in my life, leaving only bitterness and the terrible certainty that love was a weapon waiting to be used against me. "I'm losing everything," I whispered, the words coming out like a confession I'd been holding back for years. My marriage, my peace, my ability to trust anyone or anything good. I'm losing myself. "What would it cost you to let go of the anger?" Dr. Martinez asked. The question terrified me, because the anger had been my companion for so long, I'd forgotten who I was without it. If I wasn't the daughter who'd been wronged, who was I? If I wasn't justified in my resentment, what did that say about the choices I'd made, the relationships I had damaged, the years I'd spent nursing wounds that could have been healing? "I don't know how to forgive someone who's never apologized," I said. "I don't know how to let go of anger that feels more real than anything else in my life. I don't know how to trust that forgiveness won't just be another way of letting him win." "What if forgiveness isn't about him at all?" she asked. "What if it's about you choosing to stop carrying his poison in your bloodstream? Are you protecting a wound that's been bleeding for decades?" That night, I sat in my car in the parking lot outside Dr. Martinez's office for nearly an hour, afraid to go home and face David, afraid to continue living as the person I'd become, but equally afraid to try becoming someone else. I thought about the verse she'd shared, about planks and specks and the ways we can become so focused on other people's failures that we lose sight of our own. I thought about my father, probably sitting in his own house somewhere, carrying his own wounds, perhaps as trapped by his anger as I was by mine. For the first time in 20 years, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that he might be in pain rather than simply evil, that his cruelty might have been learned from his own father, that the cycle of hurt I was perpetuating might be older and more complex than I'd ever understood. But more importantly, I began to consider the possibility that I could choose to stop perpetuating it. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved freedom. Not because what he'd done was okay, but because what I was doing to myself and to everyone who tried to love me wasn't okay either. When I finally went home, David was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a book, the same way he'd been sitting the night of our fight, the same way he sat every evening while I raged against wounds that had nothing to do with him. "Hi," he said quietly, looking up from his book with eyes that held equal measures of hope and wariness. "Hi," I said back, and then, before I could lose my courage, "I owe you an apology for the fight, for the things I said, for the person I've been." He set down his book and looked at me with the kind of attention I'd been craving and avoiding in equal measure for years. "I've been angry at my father for so long I forgot how to be anything else," I continued, "and I've been taking that anger out on you, on our marriage, on everyone who tries to get close to me. You were right when you said I needed help. I've been seeing a therapist." David's face softened. "How's that going?" "Terrifying," I admitted. "I'm learning that I've become someone I don't want to be. Someone who uses love as a weapon the same way my father did. Someone who's so afraid of being hurt that she hurts other people first." I sat down across from him at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals, thousands of conversations, thousands of moments of ordinary love that I'd been too afraid to fully receive. "I don't know how to forgive him yet," I said. "I'm not even sure I want to. But I'm starting to understand that holding on to this anger is killing everything good in my life, including us." David reached across the table and took my hand, and for the first time in months, I didn't pull away. "I love you," he said simply. The person you were when I married you. The person you've become. The person you're trying to become. But I can't keep fighting a ghost, Sarah. I can't keep competing with your father for your attention. His words were both devastating and liberating, because they forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. My father was still controlling my life, 20 years after that night in the kitchen. He was still deciding how I moved through the world, how I loved, how I trusted, how I saw myself and others. He was still winning, and I was the one giving him the victory. That night, lying in bed next to my husband for the first time in weeks without a wall of anger between us, I finally understood what Dr. Martinez had been trying to help me see. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing my father's behavior or pretending his cruelty hadn't mattered. Forgiveness was about refusing to let his cruelty continue shaping my life. The next morning, I called Dr. Martinez and asked if we could schedule an extra session that week. I think I'm ready, I told her. Ready for what? To stop being my father's daughter and start being David's wife. To stop being a victim and start being a woman who chooses healing over hatred. To stop protecting a wound that's been bleeding for 20 years and start learning what it feels like to be free. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then, I'll see you tomorrow. As I hung up the phone, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror, and for the first time in years, I didn't look away. The woman looking back at me was tired, wounded, carrying scars that would probably never fully disappear. But she was also someone who was ready to stop letting those scars define her, someone who was ready to choose love over fear, someone who was ready to discover what lay on the other side of the anger that had been her constant companion for 2 decades. I wasn't ready to call my father. I wasn't ready to pretend that everything was okay. But I was ready to stop letting his failures dictate my future, ready to stop using his cruelty as an excuse for my own, ready to start the long, difficult work of becoming someone who could love and be loved without constantly bracing for betrayal. During our session the next day, Dr. Martinez introduced me to a verse that would become my lifeline. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Ephesians 4:31-32. Notice, she said, that it doesn't say forgive because they deserve it. It says forgive as you have been forgiven, not for their sake, but because you've received grace and you're called to extend it, not just to others, but to yourself. The words washed over me like cool water on burned skin. For the first time, forgiveness didn't feel like surrender. It felt like rescue. Not weakness, but the kind of strength that chooses healing over revenge, hope over despair, love over the safety of perpetual anger. I still didn't know if I'd ever have a relationship with my father. I still carried scars from that night in the kitchen that would probably never fully heal. But I was beginning to understand that forgiveness didn't require reconciliation, that releasing someone to God didn't mean releasing them back into my life, that I could honor my wounds without being imprisoned by them. Most importantly, I was learning that some chains can only be broken from the inside, and I was the only one who held the key. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Matthew 7:3. Forgiveness didn't come like lightning. It came like sunrise, so gradual I almost missed it happening. The work of forgiveness, I discovered, was nothing like what I'd expected. There was no dramatic moment of release, no sudden flood of peace, no divine intervention that instantly healed 20 years of accumulated bitterness. Instead, it began with the smallest possible step, a prayer I could barely bring myself to whisper. God, I said one morning, standing in my kitchen making coffee while David slept upstairs. I don't know how to forgive him. I don't even want to forgive him. But I'm tired of carrying this anger. If you want me to let it go, you're going to have to show me how. It was hardly the most eloquent prayer ever uttered, but it was honest in a way I hadn't been honest with God or myself in decades. I wasn't asking for the strength to forgive because I thought my father deserved it. I was asking for the strength to forgive because I was drowning in the alternative. Watch what happens when you stop waiting for someone to earn your forgiveness and start offering it as a gift to yourself. The first sign that something was shifting came during my session with Dr. Martinez, the following week. She'd asked me to try an exercise where I wrote a letter to my father, not to send, but to process the emotions I'd been carrying for so long. Write everything, she said. Every hurt, every disappointment, every moment of anger you've been storing up. Don't censor yourself. Just let it all out onto the page. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table with a blank notebook, expecting the words to pour out like they had that night months ago when I'd first acknowledged my hatred. But something strange happened. The anger felt smaller somehow. Still present, still real, but not as consuming as it had been. I wrote about the night he'd thrown the plate against the wall, about the years of walking on eggshells, about the way his cruelty had shaped my ability to trust and love. But I also found myself writing things I'd never acknowledged before, about the father who'd taught me to ride a bike before the drinking got bad, who'd come to my high school graduation despite our strained relationship, who'd cried when I walked down the aisle at my wedding. The man who'd wounded me was also a man who'd loved me, imperfectly and inadequately, but genuinely. The realization didn't excuse his cruelty, but it complicated my understanding of it in ways that felt both unsettling and somehow healing. 2 weeks later, Dr. Martinez suggested another exercise, writing a letter from my father to me, imagining what he might say if he could acknowledge the pain he'd caused. I can't do that, I said immediately. I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know if he even remembers that night or if he cares about how it affected us. You're not trying to read his mind, she said gently. You're trying to imagine what it might feel like to receive the apology you've been waiting for. What would he need to say for you to feel heard? That night, I stared at another blank page for nearly an hour before writing the first line. Dear Sarah, I know I failed you. The words that followed surprised me with their specificity, their acknowledgement not just of that one terrible night but of the atmosphere of fear and instability he'd created in our home. I wrote the apology I'd been longing to hear for 20 years, an apology that took responsibility without making excuses, that acknowledged the lasting impact of his choices, that expressed genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused. When I finished, I was crying, not from anger this time, but from something that felt dangerously close to relief. Not because I believed my father would ever actually say these words, but because writing them had shown me what I needed to hear in order to heal. And more importantly, it had shown me that I could give myself permission to heal even if I never heard them from him. The third letter was the hardest, writing to my father from the place I was now, 20 years later, as a woman who was choosing to release the anger that had defined her for so long. I'm not writing this because you deserve forgiveness, I began. I'm writing this because I deserve peace. Comment freedom if you've ever discovered that the prison door was unlocked all along. Over the following months, my prayers began to change, in ways I didn't even notice at first. Instead of asking God to punish my father or help me stay strong in my anger, I found myself praying for the ability to see him as God saw him, not excusing his behavior, but recognizing his humanity. It was during one of these prayers that I had what I can only describe as a quiet revelation. I was sitting in my favorite chair early one morning, watching the sun come up through our bedroom window, when a memory surfaced that I'd buried for decades. I was 8 years old and my father was teaching me to fish at a lake near our house. It was before the drinking became a daily occurrence, back when he still had moments of gentleness that weren't overshadowed by rage. I'd hooked something big, probably just a stick or a rock, but he'd helped me reel it in with the same patience and encouragement he might have shown if I'd caught the biggest fish in the lake. That's my girl, he'd said when we discovered it was just an old boot. You've got the heart of a fisherman. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do something just because it's hard. The memory came with a clarity that felt both painful and healing. This was also my father, the man who'd believed in me before I'd learned to doubt myself, who'd seen potential in me that he'd somehow lost the ability to nurture as his own pain consumed him. For the first time in 20 years, I found myself wondering not just about what he'd done to me, but about what had been done to him. What wounds had he been carrying that were so deep they'd turned him into someone capable of such cruelty? What pain had he been trying to numb with alcohol? What failures and disappointments had shaped him into a man who could only feel powerful by making others feel small? This is when I learned that you can release someone to God without releasing them into your life. The questions didn't excuse his behavior, but they opened a door in my heart that had been sealed shut for decades, a door that let in something I'd never expected to feel toward my father. Compassion. Not the kind of compassion that minimizes harm or pretends that abuse is acceptable, but the kind that recognizes that hurt people, that broken people break others, that the cycles of pain that destroyed my childhood had probably been destroying his long before I was born. I started praying for him, tentatively at first, afraid that asking God to bless someone who'd caused me so much pain was a betrayal of my own wounds. But gradually, those prayers became less forced, less resentful, more genuine. I prayed that he would find peace with whatever demons had driven him to drink. I prayed that he would find healing for whatever wounds had made him so cruel. I prayed that if he was still alive, I hadn't spoken to him in 5 years and had no idea what his current situation was, he would experience the kind of love and acceptance he'd been unable to give us. Most surprisingly, I prayed that he would forgive himself for the ways he'd failed as a father, because I was beginning to understand that his cruelty might have been born from his own self-hatred, his own sense of inadequacy, his own desperate attempts to feel powerful in a world where he felt powerless. What would happen if you stopped waiting for them to change and started praying for your own healing? The shift in my marriage was gradual but unmistakable. David noticed it first in small ways. The way I stopped flinching when he raised his voice in excitement, the way I began to assume good intentions instead of immediately suspecting the worst, the way I started reaching for his hand instead of pulling away when he tried to comfort me. "You're different," he said one evening as we walked through our neighborhood after dinner. "Lighter somehow." I knew what he meant. The constant vigilance that had exhausted me for years was beginning to ease. The hyper-awareness of every potential threat, every possible disappointment, every sign that love might be conditional, was slowly being replaced by something I'd almost forgotten existed. Trust. Not naive trust that ignored red flags or pretended that people couldn't hurt each other, but mature trust that chose to believe in goodness while remaining aware of the possibility of pain. Trust that recognized that love always involves risk, but that the risk was worth taking. My work began to change too. Instead of helping clients from a place of shared cynicism and protective distance, I found myself able to offer them something I was finally experiencing myself. Hope that healing was possible, that forgiveness could coexist with wisdom, that it was possible to honor your wounds without being imprisoned by them. I started leading a support group for adult children of alcoholics, something I never could have done when I was still trapped in my own anger and resentment. The group met once a week in our church basement, and I was amazed by how many people were carrying stories similar to mine, how many had been told that forgiveness was necessary for healing, but had never been shown what that actually looked like in practice. Forgiveness, I told them during one of our first meetings, doesn't mean pretending that what happened to you was okay. It doesn't mean you have to have a relationship with someone who hurt you. It doesn't even mean you have to feel warm and fuzzy toward them. "Then what does it mean?" asked a woman named Janet, whose father had abandoned the family when she was 12. "It means you stop letting their failures dictate your future. It means you refuse to give them the power to continue hurting you long after they've left your life. It means you choose to write the rest of your story based on who you want to become, not on what they did to you." The words felt revolutionary as I spoke them, because I was finally living them instead of just understanding them intellectually. The anger that had defined me for 20 years was being replaced by something much more powerful, the freedom to choose my own responses, my own beliefs, my own way of moving through the world. 6 months after I'd started therapy, I did something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. I wrote my father a letter that I actually intended to send. It wasn't the kind of letter that demanded apology or explanation. It wasn't an invitation to resume a relationship or a declaration that all was forgiven and forgotten. It was simply an acknowledgement that I was his daughter, that I was doing well, that I hoped he was at peace with his life. I told him about my marriage, my work, the ways I'd been able to use my own experiences of pain to help others heal. I told him that I'd learned to separate the father who'd hurt me from the man who'd given me life, and that I was grateful for both the gifts and the challenges he'd brought to my story. Most importantly, I told him that I was no longer carrying anger toward him, not because I'd decided he deserved forgiveness, but because I'd decided I deserved freedom. I don't know if we'll ever have a relationship, I wrote. I don't know if you're even interested in having one. But I wanted you to know that I've found peace with our story, and I hope you can find peace with it too. I mailed the letter on a Tuesday morning and immediately felt a lightness I hadn't experienced since childhood, not because I expected any particular response, but because I'd finally been able to extend grace without expecting anything in return. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from my mother. "Your father got your letter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's been carrying it around in his pocket, reading it over and over. He asked me to tell you that he's proud of the woman you've become and that he's sorry he wasn't the father you deserved." The words hit me like a gentle rain after a long drought, not because they erased the pain of the past, but because they confirmed what I'd been learning to believe, that healing was possible even when it came in forms we hadn't expected, that grace could create bridges across even the deepest wounds, that forgiveness could set both the forgiver and the forgiven free. "Is he?" I started to ask, then stopped. "How is he?" "Sober," my mother said. 3 years now, going to meetings, working with a sponsor, trying to make amends to people he hurt. He doesn't expect you to see him or talk to him. He just wanted you to know that he remembers everything, and he's sorry." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, processing emotions I didn't have names for. Relief, certainly. Validation that my pain had been real and my father finally acknowledged it. But also something deeper. The recognition that the work I'd done to forgive him hadn't been dependent on his response. I'd found freedom before he'd apologized. I'd discovered peace before he'd gotten sober. I'd learned to love and trust again before he'd made any attempt to earn back my respect. The forgiveness I'd fought so hard against had been for me all along. That night, David found me sitting on our back porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. "Free," I said, surprised by how true the word felt. "For the first time in 20 years, I feel free." Hope, signature. This is when I learned that you can release someone to God without releasing them into your life. The months that followed brought a peace I'd never experienced as an adult, not the absence of problems or pain, but the presence of something much more valuable. The ability to respond to life's challenges from a place of strength rather than fear, love rather than defensiveness, hope rather than cynicism. My relationship with David deepened in ways I'd never thought possible. Without the constant interference of my father's voice in my head, I was able to hear David's actual words, receive his actual love, trust his actual intentions. We renewed our vows on our 15th wedding anniversary, and I was able to mean them in ways I hadn't been capable of meaning them the first time. My work continued to evolve as well. The support group for adult children of alcoholics grew from 6 people to over 30. And I started receiving requests to speak at conferences about the relationship between forgiveness and healing from childhood trauma. But the most profound change was internal, the discovery that I could hold both truth and grace simultaneously, that I could acknowledge the reality of my wounds while choosing not to be defined by them, that I could protect myself from future harm without remaining trapped in past hurt. I learned to see my father not as a monster or a saint, but as a broken man who'd broken others, who'd been both the victim and perpetrator of cycles of pain that were older than either of us. I learned that understanding his brokenness didn't require me to excuse his choices, and that forgiving him didn't require me to forget what he'd done or pretend that it hadn't mattered. Most importantly, I learned that forgiveness was not a destination, but a practice. Something I chose again and again, not because it was easy or because he deserved it, but because I deserved the freedom it offered. The rotting anchor that had been dragging me down for 20 years had finally been cut loose, and I was discovering what it felt like to float, to move freely through life without the constant weight of ancient anger pulling me toward the bottom. I didn't know if I'd ever see my father again. I didn't know if he would maintain his sobriety, if he would continue working to make amends, if he would become the man he should have been all along. But I wasn't afraid of any of those unknowns anymore, because my peace was no longer dependent on his choices. My healing was no longer held hostage by his behavior. My ability to love and be loved was no longer determined by his capacity to be lovable. I had learned to separate my story from his story while still honoring the ways they had intersected. I had learned to take responsibility for the woman I was becoming without taking responsibility for the man he had been. I had learned that some prisons have keys we're too afraid to use, and that the courage to use them is one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. 1 Peter 5:7. God didn't give me the ending I wanted. He gave me the healing I needed, which turned out to be so much better. 3 years after I'd mailed that letter to my father, I received a phone call that would test everything I'd learned about forgiveness, grace, and the mysterious ways God works in our broken stories. It was my mother, her voice trembling in a way I'd never heard before. "Sarah," she said, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. "Your father's in the hospital. He had a heart attack yesterday. The doctors, they don't think he has much time left." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because I wasn't prepared for the possibility. He was 72 and had spent decades abusing his body with alcohol, but because death has a way of making everything feel suddenly urgent and final. "How long?" I asked, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "Maybe a few days, maybe less. He's awake, but he's very weak. Sarah, he's been asking for you." 20 years of bitterness dissolved not when he apologized, but when I realized I didn't need him to. The drive to the hospital took 4 hours, and I spent every minute of it cycling through emotions I didn't know how to process. Fear that I'd arrive too late, anxiety about what we might say to each other, uncertainty about whether I was making the right choice by going at all. But underneath all of that was something I hadn't expected: peace. Not because the situation was peaceful, but because I was approaching it from a place of wholeness rather than brokenness, freedom rather than bondage, choice rather than compulsion. I wasn't going to see my father because I felt obligated to forgive him, or because I needed his approval, or because I hoped for some dramatic reconciliation that would erase decades of pain. I was going because I'd learned that love could coexist with boundaries, that grace could be extended without conditions, that I could show up as the woman I'd become rather than the wounded girl I'd been. David had offered to come with me, but I knew this was something I needed to do alone. Not because I was afraid of his support, but because I wanted to face my father from the strength I'd found rather than the safety of someone else's presence. The ICU was exactly what I'd expected: sterile and bright, full of machines that beeped and hummed with artificial life. My mother was sitting beside his bed, holding his hand in a way that spoke of forgiveness I was only beginning to understand. "He looks so small," was my first thought when I saw him. The man who had loomed so large in my nightmares, who had occupied so much space in my heart and mind for so many years, looked fragile and ordinary lying in that hospital bed. "Sarah's here," my mother said softly, and my father's eyes opened. For a moment, we just looked at each other. This man who had given me life and nearly destroyed it. This daughter who had carried his failures and his love in equal measure for 36 years. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure either," I replied, pulling a chair up beside his bed. What followed wasn't the dramatic scene I'd imagined in my worst fears or my wildest hopes. There were no tears of reconciliation, no declarations of perfect forgiveness, no promises that everything would be different if only we had more time. Instead, there was something much more precious: honesty. "I remember that night," he said after a few minutes of silence. "The plate against the wall, the things I said to you and your mother. I've remembered it every day for 20 years. "I know," I said. "Mom told me you got sober. 3.5 years now. Too late to undo the damage, but not too late to stop making it worse." He paused, struggling for breath. "I was a terrible father, Sarah. I know that. I was angry at the world, and I took it out on the people who loved me most. I felt tears coming and didn't try to stop them. You were also the father who taught me to fish, who came to my graduation, who cried at my wedding. You remember that?" "I remember all of it, the good and the bad. That's what I've been learning. That people can be more than one thing at the same time." Full circle. Moment. 20 years of bitterness dissolved not when he apologized, but when I realized I didn't need him to. We talked for 2 hours that first day, about his childhood, about the pain that had driven him to drink, about the ways he'd tried and failed to be the father he'd wanted to be. He told me about his own father, a man even more violent and unpredictable than he'd been, about the cycle of hurt that had been passed down through generations of broken men who didn't know how to love without causing pain. "I'm not telling you this to make excuses," he said. "I'm telling you because I want you to know that the cycle stops with you. You broke it, Sarah. You became something better than what you came from." The words hit me like a benediction, like a blessing I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. Not because I needed his approval to validate my healing, but because hearing him acknowledge the work I'd done to become someone different felt like coming full circle. "I forgave you years ago," I told him, "not because you deserved it, but because I deserved to be free from the anger." "And are you? Free?" I thought about the question for a moment, considering all the ways my life had changed since I'd stopped letting his failures define my future. "Yes," I said, "I am." He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since I was a child. "Then I can go in peace." He died 2 days later, with my mother and me holding his hands as his breathing gradually slowed and then stopped. It was quiet and peaceful in a way that felt like grace, not because death is ever easy, but because we'd been able to say the things that needed to be said, to offer each other the gift of closure without the burden of pretense. The funeral was small, attended mostly by people from his AA group who shared stories about the man he'd become in sobriety, someone I barely recognized, but was grateful to know had existed. He'd spent his last 3 years trying to make amends to people he'd hurt, working with a sponsor, helping other alcoholics find their way to recovery. "He talked about you all the time," one of his friends told me after the service. "He was so proud of what you'd accomplished, but more than that, he was grateful that you'd found a way to heal from what he'd done to you. He said watching you become whole again gave him hope that forgiveness was possible." Standing beside his grave, watching dirt fall onto the casket that held the man who had shaped so much of my story, I felt something I'd never expected to feel at my father's funeral. Gratitude. Not gratitude for the pain he'd caused, that would always be a wound I carried, but gratitude for the way God had used even his failures to create something beautiful in my life, the way my healing had rippled out to touch other people's stories, the way his brokenness had eventually led to his redemption and mine. Ministry, birth. Now, when I meet people chained to old hurts, I don't try to convince them to forgive. I just show them my empty hands and tell them how good it feels to be free. In the months that followed my father's death, something unexpected began to happen. People started seeking me out, not just as a therapist, but as someone who had walked the difficult path from bitterness to forgiveness and could offer hope to others who were still trapped in their own cycles of anger and pain. The support group I'd been leading for adult children of alcoholics grew into something larger, a ministry focused on helping people understand that forgiveness was possible even when it seemed impossible, that healing could happen even when the person who hurt you never changed, that God could work redemption in the darkest corners of our stories. I started speaking at conferences and retreats, sharing my story with people who carried wounds similar to mine, not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone who had learned that the questions themselves could become doorways to healing. Forgiveness, I would tell them, isn't about the person who hurt you. It's about the person you choose to become despite being hurt. It's about refusing to let someone else's brokenness break you permanently. It's about trusting that God can work even the worst things in your life for good, not because those things were good, but because God is good. The ministry wasn't something I'd planned or expected. It grew organically from the overflow of my own healing, from the recognition that my pain had been transformed into something that could offer hope to others. The wounds I'd once seen as evidence of my father's failure had become scars that testified to God's ability to create beauty from ashes. I thought about something Dr. Martinez had told me during one of our last sessions. Sometimes the very things that break us become the things that make us useful to God. Your father's cruelty taught you about pain in ways that now allow you to speak to other people's pain with authenticity and compassion. She'd been right. I could offer hope to people trapped in bitterness because I'd been trapped there myself. I could speak about the possibility of forgiveness because I'd lived through the impossibility of it. I could guide others toward freedom because I remembered what it felt like to be imprisoned by my own anger. The work wasn't always easy. Some days I met with people whose stories made my own childhood seem mild by comparison, survivors of physical and sexual abuse, people whose parents had abandoned them entirely, individuals whose families had rejected them for their sexuality or their beliefs or their unwillingness to perpetuate cycles of toxicity. How can you tell me to forgive someone who destroyed my life? A young woman named Ashley asked me during one particularly difficult session. Her father had sexually abused her for years, and she was struggling with well-meaning Christians who kept telling her that forgiveness was required for healing. "I'm not telling you to forgive anyone," I replied. "I'm telling you that you get to choose what you do with the pain he caused. You can let it define you, or you can let it refine you. You can stay trapped in the prison of your anger, or you can choose to walk toward the door marked freedom, even when you can't see what's on the other side." But what if I can't? What if the anger is all I have left? I understood her question in ways that went deeper than professional training. I remembered believing that my anger toward my father was the only thing standing between me and complete destruction, that releasing it would mean forgetting what he'd done or pretending it hadn't mattered. "Then start smaller," I said. "Don't try to forgive him today. Just ask God to help you want to forgive him someday. Start with the smallest possible step toward freedom and see what happens." Have you forgiven someone who never said sorry? Could you? The questions that had once tormented me had become tools for helping others examine their own hearts. The pain that had once isolated me had become a bridge for connecting with people who felt alone in their suffering. The father, who had once been the source of my greatest wound, had become, through God's mysterious grace, part of the story that brought healing to others. 5 years after his death, I was invited to speak at a conference for adult children of addicts. As I stood on the stage looking out at hundreds of faces marked by pain similar to what I'd once carried, I thought about the girl who had sat at that kitchen table 25 years ago, watching her world shatter like ceramic against a wall. She could never have imagined that the worst night of her life would eventually become part of the best work of her life. She could never have dreamed that her father's failures would be transformed into opportunities to offer grace to others. She could never have believed that forgiveness was possible, much less that it would become the cornerstone of her ministry. "I want to tell you about my father," I began, and the words came easily now, without the sharp edges of anger or the heavy weight of resentment. He was a broken man who broke others. He was an alcoholic who chose his addiction over his family. He was someone who caused more pain than he healed, more harm than good. I paused, looking out at faces that knew exactly what kind of pain I was describing. But he was also a man who was loved by God, who found redemption in his final years, who taught me about grace in ways he never intended, and most importantly, he was part of a story that God has used to bring healing to people I never could have reached any other way. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People weeping, nodding, reaching for tissues and for each other's hands. In that moment, I understood something profound about the way God works in our broken stories. He doesn't waste our pain. He doesn't minimize our wounds. But he does find ways to transform them into something that can offer hope to others who are still bleeding. After the conference, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "I've been angry at my mother for 15 years, she said. "Listening to you tonight was the first time I've ever considered the possibility that I could forgive her without excusing what she did." "Forgiveness," I told her, "doesn't erase the past. It just refuses to let the past erase your future." As I drove home that night, I thought about the mystery of divine orchestration, the way God had taken my father's cruelty and my own stubborn bitterness and woven them together into something that could offer light to people walking in darkness. I thought about the verse that had become the foundation of my ministry. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him," Romans 8:28. Not that all things are good, but that God can work even the worst things for good in the lives of people who are willing to let him. My father's alcoholism wasn't good. His cruelty wasn't good. The pain he caused our family wasn't good, but God had worked even those terrible things for good, not by erasing them or minimizing them, but by transforming them into tools for healing that I never could have possessed any other way. The ending wasn't perfect. I still carried scars from my childhood that would probably never fully disappear. I still had moments when old triggers would surface, when I'd catch myself responding to David or my clients from the wounded place rather than the healed place. But I'd learned that healing didn't require perfection. It just required willingness. The willingness to keep choosing love over fear, grace over bitterness, hope over cynicism, again and again and again. I'd learned that some stories don't get the endings we want, but they get the endings we need. That some fathers never become the men we wish they'd been, but their failures can still be redeemed by a God who specializes in bringing beauty from ashes. Most importantly, I'd learned that forgiveness was never about them. It was always about us, about the choice to stop letting other people's brokenness break us, about the decision to write the rest of our stories based on who we want to become rather than what was done to us. My father never became the man I'd needed him to be when I was 16, but God had used even his failures to make me into the woman I was meant to be at 46, and that, I realized, was a kind of miracle all its own. Call to action. If this story gave you permission to let go of what's been holding you prisoner, share it with someone who needs to know that freedom is possible. As I pulled into my driveway that night, I saw David waiting for me on the front porch, a cup of tea in his hands and a smile on his face that told me he was proud of the work I'd done, the woman I'd become, the healing I'd found. "How did it go?" he asked as I settled beside him on the porch swing. "Good," I said, leaning into his warmth. "Really good. I think Dad would have been proud." It was the first time I'd referred to my father that way in over 20 years, not as my father or him, but as Dad. The word felt strange on my tongue, but also somehow right, like a gift I was finally able to give to the man who had loved me imperfectly but genuinely, who had failed me spectacularly, but also shaped me profoundly. "I think he would have been too," David said, kissing the top of my head. We sat in comfortable silence, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. And I thought about all the people who had heard my story that night, all the ones who might be driving home with hope where there had been despair, possibility where there had been resignation, freedom where there had been bondage. My father's legacy wouldn't be the pain he'd caused. It would be the healing that had grown from that pain, the hope that had emerged from his failures, the grace that had transformed his worst moments into opportunities for redemption. And maybe, in the end, that was exactly the kind of miracle a God of second chances and third chances and infinite chances specialized in creating. Before I went to sleep that night, I whispered one final prayer, not for my father this time, but for all the people who were still sitting at kitchen tables somewhere, watching their worlds shatter, believing that some wounds were too deep to heal and some anger too justified to release. "Show them what you showed me," I prayed. "Show them that some chains can only be broken from the inside. Show them that forgiveness is possible even when it seems impossible. Show them that their stories aren't over, that their pain has purpose, that their healing can become hope for others." And show them, I added, thinking of the girl I'd been and the woman I'd become, that the key to their prison has been in their pocket all along. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, Romans 8:28. Before you sleep tonight, I want you to ask yourself just one thing. What weight have you been carrying that God never asked you to hold on to? Maybe it's anger toward a parent who failed you. Maybe it's resentment toward a spouse who disappointed you. Maybe it's bitterness toward a friend who betrayed you, a boss who overlooked you, a system that disadvantaged you. Maybe, like me, you've been carrying someone else's failures for so long they've become part of your identity. Maybe you've been protecting a wound that stopped bleeding years ago, but has never been allowed to heal. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, I want you to imagine what it would feel like to set that weight down. Not because the person who hurt you deserves your forgiveness, but because you deserve the freedom that comes from releasing what was never yours to carry in the first place. You don't have to fix it all. You just have to open your hands. Forgiveness isn't a feeling. It's a choice you make again and again until one day you realize the anger that once defined you has been replaced by something much more powerful. peace. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't require you to trust people who've proven themselves untrustworthy or to have relationships with people who continue to cause harm. But it does set you free from the prison of your own bitterness. It does allow you to write the rest of your story based on who you want to become rather than what was done to you. It does open up possibilities for healing you never knew existed. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. Isaiah 43:2. Some chains can only be broken from the inside, and the key has been in your pocket all along. The conference room was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles. I looked out at nearly 1,000 faces, survivors of childhood trauma, adult children of addicts, people carrying wounds from parents who had loved them poorly or not at all. But what struck me most wasn't the pain in their eyes. It was the hope, the expectation that healing was possible, that their stories weren't over, that the worst chapters of their lives didn't have to define the ones still being written. 10 years ago, I began, I sat in a therapist's office and realized I'd become the person I'd spent my whole life trying not to become. I'd let my father's cruelty turn me into someone capable of emotional violence. I'd let his failures dictate my future. I'd let his poison run through my bloodstream until it infected every relationship I tried to build. A woman in the front row nodded, tears already streaming down her face. Behind her, a young man leaned forward in his seat, hungry for words that might unlock the prison he'd been living in. But here's what I've learned in the decades since I chose forgiveness over bitterness. Healing is contagious. When you break the cycle of hurt in your own life, you create space for others to break it in theirs. When you choose love over fear, grace over revenge, hope over cynicism, you become living proof that transformation is possible. I thought about all the people who had found freedom through the ministry that had grown from my own healing. Ashley, the young woman who had been sexually abused by her father, who now led support groups for other survivors. Marcus, whose mother had abandoned him when he was 8, who had become a foster parent to children aging out of the system. Jennifer, whose husband had left her for his secretary, who now counseled other women through divorce recovery. All of them had learned what I'd learned, that our wounds, when surrendered to God, could become sources of healing for others, that our pain, when processed through the filter of grace, could become tools for setting other captives free. The ripple effect of forgiveness, I continued, doesn't stop with you. When you forgive someone who hurt you, you're not just freeing yourself, you're freeing your children from inheriting your bitterness. You're freeing your spouse from competing with ghosts. You're freeing future generations from cycles of pain that have been passed down like toxic heirlooms for decades or even centuries. I told them about my father's transformation in sobriety, how the man who had once been a source of destruction had spent his final years trying to repair the damage he'd caused. I told them about my mother, who had finally left her own prison of enabling and codependency to build a life of dignity and peace. I told them about David and me, how our marriage had been reborn when I stopped bringing my father's voice into our conversations. But the most beautiful part of this story, I said, my voice breaking slightly with emotion, is that it's still being written. Every time one of you chooses healing over hatred, every time you extend grace to someone who doesn't deserve it, every time you refuse to let someone else's brokenness break you permanently, you're adding a new chapter to a story of redemption that began long before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. The applause that followed was thunderous, but more moving than the sound was what I could see happening in the room. People reaching for tissues, for each other's hands, for hope they'd thought was beyond their reach. After the session, I was approached by a woman who looked to be in her 60s, with silver hair and eyes that held both deep pain and unexpected peace. "I'm Dr. Rebecca Martinez," she said, extending her hand. "I think we know each other." It took me a moment to recognize my former therapist, the woman who had helped me see that some mirrors show us things we never wanted to see but desperately needed to. She looked older, softer somehow, but her eyes still held the same gentle wisdom that had guided me through the darkest period of my life. "Dr. Martinez," I said, embracing her warmly. "What are you doing here?" "I'm retired now," she said with a smile, "but I heard you were speaking, and I wanted to see how the story turned out. And, even better than I hoped, you've become exactly who I knew you could become when you finally stopped being afraid of your own healing. We talked for nearly an hour, catching up on the years that had passed since our last session. She told me about her own retirement, her grandchildren, her volunteer work with homeless veterans. I told her about the ministry, the books I'd written, the conferences around the world where I shared the message that forgiveness was possible even when it seemed impossible. You know what strikes me most about your story, she said as we prepared to part ways. What's that? How ordinary it is. Not the pain, unfortunately that's far too common, but the healing, the choice to forgive, the decision to break cycles rather than perpetuate them. These are choices available to anyone, but so few people believe they're possible. Why do you think that is? Because we've been taught that forgiveness is weakness instead of strength, that grace is naive instead of powerful, that holding on to anger somehow protects us from future hurt, when really it just ensures that past hurt continues to control our present choices. As I watched her walk away, I thought about the truth in her words. The healing I'd experienced wasn't miraculous in the sense of being supernatural. It was miraculous in the sense of being available to anyone willing to do the hard work of choosing love over fear, again and again and again. That evening, I called my mother from my hotel room. "How was the conference?" she asked. "Beautiful," I said. "Hard, but beautiful. How are you doing?" "Good, really good. I've been thinking about your father a lot lately. Tomorrow would have been our 45th wedding anniversary." We were both quiet for a moment, honoring the complexity of grief for someone who had been both a source of love and a source of pain. "Do you miss him?" I asked. "I miss the man he became at the end," she said. "I miss the father he was trying to be in those last few years. But mostly, I'm grateful for the way his story ended, with redemption instead of destruction, with healing instead of bitterness." "Me too," I said, and meant it. After we hung up, I sat by the window of my hotel room, looking out at a city full of people carrying their own wounds, their own stories of betrayal and disappointment and pain. How many of them, I wondered, were trapped in prisons of their own making, convinced that their anger was strength and their bitterness was protection? How many of them needed to hear that forgiveness was possible, that healing was available, that the chains they'd been wearing for years could be unlocked with keys they already possessed? I thought about the ripple effect that had started with my own healing, not just the people who attended my conferences or read my books, but the ones they went home to love better, the children they raised with grace instead of criticism, the marriages they saved by choosing forgiveness over resentment. I thought about the cycles that were being broken, the pain that was being transformed into purpose, the wounds that were becoming sources of healing for others. Most of all, I thought about my father and the way God had used even his failures to create something beautiful. Not because his failures were good, but because God is good, and he specializes in writing stories of redemption with the most unlikely materials. The man who had once been a source of my greatest wound had become, through the mystery of divine grace, part of the story that brought healing to thousands of others. His legacy wasn't the pain he'd caused, it was the forgiveness that pain had made possible, the ministry that had grown from the ashes of his failures, the hope that had emerged from the deepest places of despair. Before I fell asleep that night, I whispered the same prayer I'd been praying for 10 years. "Thank you for showing me that some stories don't end the way we expect them to. They end the way we need them to. Thank you for proving that forgiveness is possible even when it seems impossible. Thank you for using my pain to bring healing to others and for turning my father's failures into opportunities for grace. And thank you," I added, thinking of all the people who were still sitting in the darkness of their own anger, still believing that some wounds were too deep to heal, for never giving up on any of us, even when we've given up on ourselves. The next morning, I flew home to David, to the life we'd built on the foundation of forgiveness, to the work of helping others discover that their stories weren't over, that their pain had purpose, that their healing could become hope for people they might never meet, but whose lives would be forever changed by their choice to break cycles instead of perpetuating them. And as the plane lifted off the ground, carrying me toward home, I thought about the verse that had become the cornerstone of everything I believed about forgiveness and redemption. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Not that all things are good, but that God can work even the worst things for good in the lives of people who are willing to let him. My father's alcoholism, his cruelty, the 20 years I'd spent trapped in bitterness, the marriage that had nearly been destroyed by my inability to trust, the pain that had shaped so much of my story. God had worked all of it for good, not by erasing it or minimizing it, but by transforming it into something that could offer hope to others walking similar paths, struggling with similar wounds, trapped in similar prisons of their own making. The story that had begun with a broken plate and a shattered sense of safety had become a testament to the power of forgiveness to heal not just individuals, but families, communities, entire generations. And it was still being written, one healed heart at a time, one broken cycle at a time, one person at a time, choosing grace over bitterness, love over fear, hope over despair. The ripple effect of one woman's choice to forgive would continue long after I was gone, spreading outward in ways I would never know, touching lives I would never meet, breaking chains I would never see. Because that's how forgiveness works. It's never just about us. It's about everyone our healing will touch, everyone our freedom will inspire, everyone our story will encourage to believe that their own story isn't over yet. The kitchen table where my 16-year-old self had watched her world shatter was thousands of miles away now, part of a house that had been sold years ago in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. But the healing that had grown from that shattered moment would continue forever, rippling outward through time and space, proving again and again that God specializes in making beautiful things from broken pieces, hope from despair, ministries from wounds, and miracles from the most ordinary choice of all, the choice to forgive. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Ephesians 4:31-32. This verse, which had once felt like an impossible command, had become the foundation of everything beautiful in my life. Not because forgiveness was easy, but because it was necessary. Not because people deserved it, but because I deserved the freedom it offered. The ministry that had grown from my healing had helped thousands of people understand that forgiveness wasn't about the person who hurt them. It was about the person they chose to become despite being hurt. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Matthew 7:3. This verse had forced me to see that while I'd been examining my father's failures, I'd become blind to my own transformation into everything I despised. It had shown me that healing required me to take responsibility for the person I was becoming, not just the person who had hurt me. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. First, Peter 5:7. This verse had taught me that surrendering my pain to God included surrendering my right to revenge, my need for justice, and my demand for apologies. It had shown me that casting my anxiety on God was the first step toward freedom. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Romans 8:28. This verse had become the cornerstone of my faith and my ministry. Not the promise that all things are good, but the promise that God can work even the worst things for good in the lives of people who love him and are willing to let him transform their pain into purpose. Each of these verses had been a stepping stone on the path from bitterness to forgiveness, from bondage to freedom, from pain to purpose. They had guided me through the darkest valleys of my journey and illuminated the way forward when I couldn't see past my own anger and hurt. But more than that, they had become tools for helping others find their own way to freedom. In every support group, every conference, every counseling session, these verses offered hope to people who had believed that forgiveness was impossible, that healing was beyond their reach, that their stories were doomed to end in bitterness and pain. The Word of God, I had learned, was indeed living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, able to divide soul from spirit, joints from marrow, and truth from deception. It had cut through 20 years of accumulated anger and revealed the path to freedom that had been there all along. And it continued to do the same for others, one verse at a time, one heart at a time, one story at a time. The divine closure I had experienced wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of countless other stories of healing and hope that would ripple outward for generations to come. Because that's what happens when God takes our broken pieces and makes them into something beautiful. The beauty multiplies, the healing spreads, and the story of redemption continues to be written in ways we never could have imagined. My father's failures had been transformed into opportunities for grace. My wounds had become sources of healing for others. My story of forgiveness had become a beacon of hope for people trapped in their own prisons of bitterness. And the ripple effect would continue long after I was gone, proving again and again that God really can work all things, even the worst things, for good.